First of all, what motivated me to get down this Kanban path in the first place? That's a very old story now. It's more than a decade old. And it largely amounted to trying to do Agile at any sort of scale in a big company. And in my experience, that was Sprint, which is a telephone company, a bit like BT. And at Motorola, which was a manufacturer of mobile telephones once upon a time. And in both of those companies, you could get maybe a single department, so 30 people, you could get them doing an Agile method quite nicely and they'd be outperforming everyone else. Welcome, Chris.
Hi.
And that would be fine. And some more senior executive, like a vice president, somebody with a nice corner office, would call me in there and say, whatever you're doing is great, could you just help us get everyone else to do it? And all those other people would resist. They would resist for what seemed like illogical reasons, and they would get sort of passive-aggressive on the top-down memorandum that had been sent saying you should all adopt this thing that David's department is doing. And it didn't work. It didn't work at Sprint, and it didn't work at Motorola. And by the time I'd seen it for the second time, and that was in 2002, I'd figured that scaling out Agile methods was hard. And it wasn't because they were bad, it's because people resisted for illogical reasons. And my first reaction to this was, oh, we just have to force them to do it. More positional power, more brute force effort. And I was very fortunate that I had a senior vice president, chief marketing officer at Sprint who wouldn't give me that power. That somehow he intuitively felt that was the wrong thing to do. And at Motorola, I didn't have the political capital to get the power. At Sprint, I had lots of political capital. I could waltz into C-level executives' offices and ask for it. Or I could take them to the pub, actually. And after 5 beers, he still said no. Right? So it occurred to me that I needed a different approach. That it wasn't to say Agile methods were bad or they were broken. It's just that if people weren't going to adopt it easily, it wasn't very pragmatic. It wasn't that useful. So I needed a better way of improving the agility of the organization in a way that would stick. So I started looking for what I called an incremental approach. Could we do just one thing at a time, like a laser-focused weapon? Figure out what the one top problem we've got is and fix that and then move on to number 2. And I thought of it as an incremental problem. Along the way, I discovered that we could deploy virtual Kanban systems to fix a lot of commonly recurring problems. And then later I discovered that doing that caused the sort of an evolutionary approach of one change would follow another. That once you put the Kanban system in there, it sort of stimulated discussion about doing more. So that was all very well. We didn't have any theory or method behind it. It was kind of an accident, evolution in action, experimental thing. Well, now I have some explanation for why. And I'm going to pick on Daniel Kahneman here because his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is quite recent, and his model is very simple and it's easy to explain, although it's based on a lot of other psychology and neuropsychology, and other people have different metaphors, different ways of explaining this. But Kahneman divides the way we think into what he calls System 1 and System 2, and System 1 primarily refers to the amygdala in the brain, and the part of the brain that takes in all our sensory perception, our sight, our hearing, our smell, our touch. And it drives the chemical process that strengthens or weakens synapses in the brain. And it's essentially a sensory perception pattern matching engine, and it's very fast. That's why Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink is called Blink, because this thing makes decisions in a blink of an eye. However, it's very slow to learn. the way that System 1 learns is it literally has to be rewired. It's like taking an electronic circuit board apart and rewiring it again. But with the brain, it's a chemical process. It takes hours, days, weeks, months, even years in some cases. So it makes decisions quickly. They're largely good decisions. Blink is about when the decisions are not good, but slow to learn, and that's potentially problematic. And the other thing is it's learned by experience. The only way that System 1 learns is by doing stuff and failing at it. You literally have to do it, you have to experience it, it has to be physical, you have to see it, you have to hear it, you have to touch it, you have to smell it. You have to do it even just doing stuff like this. The body will remember that just because you actually did it. You didn't think about the theory of what would it take to move a can of Coke, right, 10 centimeters across the table. You just did it and you learn that you can do that. The other thing is System 2. This is the frontal cortex in the brain. It is the logical inference engine. We're very lucky to have one. Not every animal on the planet has one. Pretty much all the other warm-blooded vertebrates on the planet, they have one of these, but only a few of us are lucky enough to have a System 2. System 2 does logical reasoning. It's slow. You'll know this because if I ask you to add up some long numbers, or say do some long division, like 563 divided by 27, a pocket calculator will blow you away at that. It will blow you away on time and accuracy. But System 2 is fast to learn, and it's learning from theory. If you're bad at long division, like my 8-year-old was when she was 8, then you teach the theory of what's causing the error, and she learns to stop making the error very quickly after a few nights of doing homework. So this is all very well. Why is it important to change? Well, if we apply this to the change process, let's say we've got 2 workers from our team in the office here, and one of them is a carbon-based life form. There he is. Looks like he works in an office here in London. And then we have his colleague, silicon-based life form. Now, when we ask silicon-based life form to adopt our new Agile method, he says, I logically evaluate your proposal with my System 2, because he's unusual. He only has a System 2, no System 1 inside him. And I adapt quickly because it makes complete logical sense, and I think Agile methods are fantastic, and we'll start doing it tomorrow. On the other hand, carbon-based life form on the other side here, he says, I feel change emotionally using System 1, and I adapt very slowly. And fundamentally, what the problem is related to identity and social status. So all of us have a sense of identity, and that sense of identity exists in our System 1. So we have an ego, we have a self-image, we have a way of determining our self-esteem. And part of our self-image is things like our job title, or what we consider we do for a living, how we add value to the community, to the social groups we hang out in, to the entire human race, if you think big. And meanwhile, as an individual, we don't thrive and survive as individuals. We live in social groups, and our social groups have identities. We're at one right now. What is it called? What is this meetup thing called here? The BCS something or other. Lazaro? So there you are. You guys have an identity. Right? And you're members of this social group, and like it or not, there will be some kind of social hierarchy. Laszlo's obviously a higher ranking member because he gets to introduce me at the beginning. Right? Now, in some cases, the way for calculating that social hierarchy is quite obvious. Somebody gets to introduce me at the beginning. In other times, it's not obvious, and it's usually not obvious to outsiders. So, anytime someone comes along and they make a change proposal, that attacks someone's identity or their social groups or their social group identity or the method of calculating the social hierarchy. Because in all warm-blooded vertebrate animals on the planet, there is social hierarchy. Right? Anarchy does not exist in nature. Right? So anarchism, which is very popular in the American Agile community, is a theory. It doesn't exist in practice. Right? Everywhere else has social hierarchy. The real universe has social hierarchy, and when you threaten it, when you walk in to a small herd of Java developers and propose that you should stop doing Java and that all the projects going forward should be done in Ruby or Scala or something else, you have completely randomized the method of calculating the social hierarchy in that group. Almost everyone in the group will be afraid. This is fundamentally where the resistance comes from. Right? So you walk in with a method that's full of roles and responsibilities like Scrum, you are asking people to change their identity and they will resist. You might get it to work in a department or two, but when you try and do it across 3,000 or 4,000 people, there's going to be a lot of them that will resist. And if you get really senior executive power to mandate that they all do it, the resistance will simply be passive-aggressive, and the results will be lackluster. Right, so now I have a way of explaining this, but I've known this for well over a decade, and yet still people are trying to make money out of you guys selling scaled agile. Right? That's the current fashionable trend, and it's something that I abandoned as an approach over a decade ago, because it's fundamentally at odds with human nature. That's the background, so I'll just talk through that. So the Kanban method rejects the traditional approach to change. You don't come along with your designed or defined prescribed method and try and install it on people, because if it has roles and responsibilities in it, you're giving people new identities and you are randomizing the way the social groups work. They will resist that. So it's better to avoid the resistance than to push harder against it. Pushing harder against it is things like, so Mr. Big Boss, can you give me a promotion and some more positional power and maybe a bit of a mandate? Tell the whole company that they have to do what David says. That's the pushing harder against it approach. And that doesn't work very well. People might pretend. They can pretend for a long time, right? They can go away for 2 days of brainwashing and they can come back certified. And when they ride their little folding bike into work in the morning, they slip into the toilets and they pull on their invisible suit of Scrum Master. And they walk around the office, look at me, I'm pretending to be a Scrum Master and none of you can tell that I'm really not. And then when the management that wanted this change to happen turn their attention to something else or roll out of that position or roll out to another job in another company, these people sigh a great big sigh of relief. Oh, thank God for that. I don't need to wear this invisible suit anymore. And they discard that and they go back to the old way of doing it because fundamentally their identity did not change. They're still a good old PMI project manager with PMP on their email signature. Right? Unless people embrace the identity change, it doesn't stick. And getting people to change their identity is incredibly hard. So I decided not to do that, right? So I built a method and it sort of evolved into what we call the Kanban method now, but it was designed to fit with the nature of the universe and particularly with human nature and the way carbon-based life forms on this planet actually work. So the idea is that the visualization and the virtual Kanban system are what stimulate the change to happen. I didn't know that was going to be the case. It's sort of an accident. We tried to use virtual Kanban systems for specific problems, eliminating overburdening, eliminating unevenness in flow, deferring commitment where people were committing too early. And then we discovered that it created this continuous improvement effect. And then I wrote it all down. And that's already a long time ago. So I want you to think about the idea that Kanban's a method without methodology. If you look up on Alistair Coburn's website, you'll discover that he is a methodologist. That tells you something about his identity. We know this because he's a PhD in methodology. And as you might expect, a PhD on methodology's website, it has a definition of what methodology actually means. And a methodology must have roles and responsibilities in it. In other words, it must tell people how to change their identity. Or more accurately, it describes the new identities they should adopt. That's all very well, but System 1 isn't going to like it. So Kanban's a method without methodologies. There are no roles in the Kanban method. It is not a methodology. It is not a software development lifecycle process or a project management process. It's a management method for helping people understand the business they're in and how they improve. So this little bit of philosophy that comes from Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was a philosopher, degree in philosophy from the University of Washington in Seattle, better known for his Kung Fu, obviously. But his Kung Fu came about because of his philosophy. He rejected the existing approaches to teaching Kung Fu, or Chinese martial arts, and he developed his own method that he described as the way without way. There was no patterned kata in Bruce Lee's method. And along part of his other philosophy, he had a book on philosophy called Striking Thoughts, was that he would teach martial artists that they should be like water, because water flows around a rock. And the rock is a metaphor for resistance. And in martial arts, that's your opponent. But for us, resistance is the emotional resistance to change that's coming from System 1. So the Kanban approach is to flow around that as much as possible. And the sort of advanced level understanding of this is that the water smooths away the rock, that gradually the resistance erodes. And something that I teach people in my advanced classes, and there's a couple of them in the audience here tonight because I'm teaching a class in London this week, is how do you emotionally motivate people so that they overcome their emotional resistance? Because you do not fight emotional resistance with a logical argument. Anyone who's ever been married knows this to be true. Right? That you motivate people to overcome emotional resistance. You have to move them. You don't persuade them with logic. So, Kanban should be like water. The resistance is our carbon-based life form with a System 1 installed. And we need to flow around his resistance. We need to find ways of improving the organization that don't change his identity or his social group membership or his hierarchy in the social groups or the identity of those social groups. In other words, company reorgs are not a good idea. People resist those. They don't like it. Right? If you take a nice social groups, let's say they're the database administrators, they're a little tribe of database administrators. They all live in their own little tribal homeland. They wear special uniforms and they've got arcane language so they can identify themselves from everyone else. Imagine you take those people and you blitz their organization and then you drop them into other dev teams and you say, you guys are all DevOps teams now. You've all got your own DBA embedded in the team. The DBAs will resist that. It might make logical sense, but they do not like the fact that you destroyed their social group and therefore their standing and their social status in the hierarchy of the company. So, the principles of the method are you start with what you do now, you agree to pursue evolutionary change, and you initially respect roles, responsibilities, and job titles. And all of these are in there because System 1 objects. And then, how do you actually make this work? How do you make this process of improving work? Well, we boiled it down to 6 practices or capabilities that need to be installed in the organization. You need to be able to see work. Why do you need to visualize invisible work? Because system 1 cannot engage unless you can see it. Right? A printout from your tracking system isn't engaging. Right? A spreadsheet isn't engaging. But a board on the wall with sticky notes on it that you have to walk up to and move, that's got system 1 written all over it. You have to move to do it. It's tactile. You feel it. You can see it. You stand in a group around it in the morning. It's very emotionally engaging. People start to understand how things work when they couldn't see it previously. We limit the work in progress. That's the Kanban system. We start managing the flow. We make other invisible things visible. We make policies explicit, rules for how we manage risk, rules for how we do governance in the company, that kind of thing. We have some feedback loops, and then collaboratively, we experiment with ways of improving when we see where the problems are. That's the Kanban method. So the talk was about the Kanban agendas. And how did this come about? Well, 2 years ago, we hold an event every year called the Kanban Leadership Retreat. It's a non-conference over about 3 days. We've done it in Reykjavik, twice in the Austrian Alps, and this year we're doing it on a beach in Portugal. And we get experienced Kanban trainers, coaches, and sometimes clients from bigger firms for doing Kanban initiatives. And we get them together and they talk about whatever they want. It's a non-conference. And 2 years ago, the question was, how do we get mainstream adoption of Kanban? How do we get it to cross the chasm, as people say, right? Once we've exhausted the enthusiast and early adopter market, how do we get those conservative mainstream people to think it's a good idea? And part of getting the mainstream to buy in is devising a compelling reason to buy. So a group of us decided to analyze that market space and ask, what's the compelling reason? A compelling reason has to be emotional, and ideally it has to be personal. There has to be a what's in it for me, but it's not a logical what's in it for me. It's a feeling. It's a system 1 engagement. So we broke the market for mainstream adopters into line level managers and individual contributors, middle managers and senior level executives. And we came to the conclusion that most of the compelling reason for Agile is relief from an abusive environment. It's pretty much what Ken Schwaber sold with Scrum. It wasn't what Kent Beck was selling with extreme programming. But if you look at the Agile market today, why you get grassroots adoption is largely, I work in a shitty place where lots of shitty decisions are made, all the managers are morons, we end up working a lot of overtime, and shit comes out the end because all sorts of stupid things get done. And if only people listened to everything we came up with in the pub after work, everything would be wonderful. We all know how to put the world at right when we've had a few beers with our colleagues, but nobody in any power or position of authority ever does it. So let's just install an Agile method and wow, we've got relief from an abusive environment. Kanban does the same thing. What about mid-level managers? Well, most mid-level managers that make decisions find themselves doing something else, like giving talks like this for a living. Right? Successful middle managers are people who sit on their hands and do nothing largely. So why is it that that happens? Well, usually because they're shit scared to answer hard questions from the senior guys, and when lower level guys come to them for advice and guidance with problems, they're afraid to make decisions. And why? Because they don't trust anything. They don't trust the information that's coming. They don't understand their environment. There's too much uncertainty. The market's always moving on them. And no decision, in their opinion, is better than any decision. How can we flip that coin over? How can we give them enough confidence that they can make good quality decisions? Well, we believe that Kanban helps put in place the data and the information to do that. Now we need to sell them on it. So answer hard questions with confidence and make difficult decisions with confidence in terms of up managing and down managing. This is a compelling reason for a middle manager. If he can do that effectively, he'll become a senior manager soon enough. Meanwhile, senior managers, largely they rely on their entire network, and it's all about trust and loyalty, and they can't make promises to people they're going to break. Right? So they have to be able to make promises they can keep, and meanwhile they have to be able to look good at things like strategy and positioning of the business. So if we could help with these things, then Kanban could be compelling for them. The main thing they care about is predictability, but there are other things to do with strategy. If you've got the wrong strategy, your company won't be around for very long. And if you're in a highly uncertain market, how can you ever know you've got the right strategy? The best strategy is actually to be adaptable and figure it out as you go along. So hence the survivability agenda. How do you put in place an adaptive capability in your organization so that, as Stephen Parry here in the UK likes to say, you can sense and respond. You can figure out what's going on in the market and you can adapt quickly. That's the definition of business agility. Meanwhile, what about the middle managers? Well, Kanban embeds this service-oriented agenda. And we're going to talk about these in the rest of the talk. And for the bottom, we have what they call the sustainability agenda. And I will confess to being vain and figuring out 3 alliterative terms that allowed me to refer to this as the 3 S's. We could have come up with other words for this. So how did this agenda thing come about? Well, about 2 years ago, a German guy called Kurt Hausler was in one of my advanced classes. And usually when I'm teaching Kanban coaches, I'm teaching them this very neutral position. I'm trying to brainwash them from their agile coaching training. Because agile coaches tend to walk in and they've got kind of this arrogant position of whatever you're doing now, it's wrong. It's all very old. You guys are dinosaurs, you're doing 20th century processes, and what you need to do is stop doing that and start doing agile stuff. And all that's likely to do is inflame a bad situation. Apart from the people who want relief from abuse, everyone else is going to start resisting. And probably the client already makes quite a nice profit. They must be doing something right. So I teach people to walk in and say, okay, your situation is what it is. Let's start with what you do now and figure out how to make it better. You wouldn't have invited me here if you didn't think there was a problem. Let's see if we can make it better. And that the coach should be agnostic to what direction we go in to make it better. As long as the outcome's better, that's the way I teach. And there's a few people in the audience who have been in these classes, so they'll know this. Well, Kurt was unhappy with this because he felt, it sounds like you're teaching us to be organizational psychologists, because that's how a therapist would work, right? That they take a neutral position and they ask you, how do you want to improve? Right? And that's really not true. There is an agenda. So Kurt got unhappy and he pushed me and he pushed me and he said, you know, we need to be more explicit about the hidden agendas. And that created a discussion that resulted in this. Man, that was a long intro to get to here. All right, so the survivability agenda. Right, so if you start with what you do now and you make some change, how do you know if the change is an improvement or not? Well, if we've got an evolutionary process, evolution gives us some guidance on this. Whether a mutation in biological evolution thrives and survives is determined by whether it's fitter for its environment. There's a little more to it than that, but that'll do for tonight's talk. If the change, the mutation's fitter for its environment, it will thrive. And if it's not, it will die out. Well, if we make a change in our process, if we can understand what represents fitness for purpose, what do our customers actually care about, then we can evaluate whether the change made us fitter for purpose or not. And if it didn't, we could take the change out. So imagine that this point here represents our definition of our current process, our current workflow. And we're going to make a change to it. Well, we can evaluate the fitness of it, and we can say, well, you know, we could be doing better, we could be faster, or our quality could be higher, or something like that. So we change our process, and we continue to evaluate its fitness. And we continue to make changes. Well, it turns out this one wasn't an improvement. Right? We evaluated the fitness and said, oh, actually, back here was better. So what should we do? Well, we could roll back. We could just take the change to the process out and go back to the old process. But it's also equally valid in evolution to go forwards. You can just keep rolling forward. You can keep making other changes, but you keep evaluating the fitness. The thing here is there's no end point. You're never done with this. There's no concept of we've completed our agile transition, we are now agile. Right? We're just always evaluating fitness and adjusting our process if we feel we're not fit enough. And it's a two-sided problem. It's not just necessarily our process that's changing. The external environment could be changing. And we now have captured many Kanban case studies where what forced the change was that the external environment changed on the company. And in one example we've published, which is the Lean and Kanban rollout at the Blizzard ski factory in Mittersill in Austria, where the entire company has been revolutionized by putting Lean into the manufacturing and Kanban into IT and in some of the QA functions. What caused them to need to do that and make a change from the old way they made skis is essentially global warming and two statistically unlikely bad winters with very little snow in 2006 and 2007, which resulted in very few skis being sold, and basically a global glut of unsold ski inventory around the world, and the company ran out of money. They ran out of working capital, and they were faced with an extinction level event. They were faced with closure. The largest employer in that region of the Alps would have economically decimated the entire region. Right? And they turned that around. They saved the company. They're now the fittest for purpose ski manufacturer in the world. And the only lean ski manufacturer. It's a great story. You can download it as a PDF from our website. So let's evaluate what we mean by fitness for purpose for a service. And here we have our service delivery boy with our pizza that we've called for. And if we order a pizza for, say, office delivery here because we're working late, what do we care about? Right? How would you evaluate whether it was a good pizza delivery service and you should use them again or not? What do you actually care about? Speed. You'd like it reasonably quickly. Now, what do you think a reasonable expectation? Would you expect them to deliver your pizza here to Zuhlke within 5 minutes? No. 5 minutes you'd be blown away. But your expectation is probably a bit less than that, maybe 20 minutes. What about an hour? Not so much, right? If it's an hour, you've probably raided the vending machine and eaten some Mars bars or something, right? And when the pizza shows up, you're not hungry anymore. So we care about the delivery time. What about if you ordered ham and pineapple and they turn up with a pepperoni? You might be unhappy, particularly if you'd ordered a vegetarian because you are vegetarian and they turn up with a pepperoni. Right, that's called functional quality. What about non-functional quality? Does your pizza taste good or not? Right? You care about that too, right? You'll talk about it with your friends about whether it's good, tasty pizza from this service or not. What about predictability? If they tell you, oh, that'll be ready for you in 25 minutes, you know, so keep an eye out on the door for the pizza boy coming, and then they show up in an hour, right? You'll be unhappy about that. On the other hand, safety. Do we care whether our pizza boy here breaks any traffic laws while he was delivering our pizza? Probably not. Now, ethically we probably should, but the reality is we don't, right? So, if we don't care about that, do we care about health and safety at the restaurant where they cooked the pizza? Yeah. These turn out to be the big four: delivery time, quality, predictability, safety. Now, other ways of evaluating fitness are things like customer satisfaction surveys, employee satisfaction surveys, things like Net Promoter Score. Right? That's a way of evaluating fitness. But it's really not as useful as something like this, because this tells you what to do. If we're not fast enough, it tells us we need to get faster. If our quality's not good, it tells us we need to improve it. On the other hand, if your Net Promoter Score is 2.3, and last month it was 2.7, what are you supposed to do about that? Go out in the street and bribe people to vote you up on next month's survey? I have clients, senior executives that get these reports, the NPS reports every month, and they basically sit there and shrug. Because it's like, oh, people don't like us as much this month. Gee, I wonder what caused that. And from their level, they have no idea what might be causing it. All it will tell you is whether you're winning or losing. It won't tell you what to do. But if you have some idea of what people really care about, what represents fitness for purpose, you know what to do. So you need to be able to understand this with real customers, and over time it might change. Your market might be maturing, the customers might change their opinions about things. So you need to be able to sample it. It's what Stephen Parry refers to as sensing. Sensing what people actually care about so you can respond by delivering them what they care about. Okay, this is real data from the CME Group's 9X exchange from two teams that do maintenance on trading floor systems for 9X. Any investment bankers here in the audience today? One or two. Right, so what we've got here is a lead time histogram from one team and another one from another team, sampled over the same time period of 2 months early last year. And you can see that these guys doing change requests for one system, they do most of them in 5 or 10 days, but some of them take up to 70. And this team does most in sort of 5 to 10 days, and the maximum is 30. Which of these two departments is fitter for purpose? Not answering is the right answer. We don't know, because we don't actually know what the customer considers acceptable, right? If, for example, you think it's acceptable to have 25 minutes for pizza delivery, and you've got two options, one that can do it in 25 minutes, another that can do it in 20 minutes, you don't actually care which one you order from. They're both good enough. Once you're past the good enough threshold, you don't care. Well, if good enough was 70 days or less, this department is fit for purpose, and so is this one. But it turns out that 9X do know what represents an acceptable customer lead time for their change requests on their trading floor systems. So the chart on the bottom, 0 represents met the SLA. And it's, so everything from 0 to the left is on-time delivery, and everything to the right is late, right? Didn't meet customer expectation. And over here, and then going this way. And what we can see from this is that Department B here is fitter for purpose. They deliver 5 out of 7 things on time, where System A, the Department A, only does 3 out of 7. Now, I have to tell you, 5 out of 7 is not stellar, right? With the data we have that shows up at Kanban conferences, 5 out of 7 within some service level expectation isn't stellar. There is room for improvement, but it's way better than 3 out of 7. So if you're a senior manager at 9X and you're thinking, which one of 2 departments would I rather send my change request to, then Department B ought to be your choice. We understand that they're fitter for purpose, and meanwhile, manager of Department A ought to be figuring out how to do something about it. Right, so business risks, fitness criteria, classes of service in the Kanban system, they should all align. So for example, if you care about the cost of delay for something, then you have to measure lead time as a metric. And the feedback loops in Kanban are the stand-up meeting, what we now call the system capability review or a service delivery review, and the operations review. And you should use the same metrics regardless of what level you're at. So what we've got here is a team in front of the board on a daily basis, a weekly meeting to review a single system's capability, and a monthly meeting to review a system of systems capability. Regardless of which level, you want to use the same metrics, right? Expose the business risks and the classes of service as visualizations on the Kanban system, and the fitness criteria, make them explicit and use them as the metrics. So lead time, quality, predictability, the same metric everywhere, regardless of where you are in the workflow or at what level you are, because all of these are external, right? They're environmental variables from the external environment. It's what people care about externally. If you use these metrics, you drive changes in behavior inside that's meaningful on the outside. You don't suffer from local optimization. Right, so know why you're using a metric. Your metric should either be a fitness criteria metric, or it should be a metric for evaluating and guiding a specific change. Something you've decided needs to be done to improve the fitness criteria, and it's therefore temporary. It's there for a while you're doing the change. And if it's not one of these 2, you do not need it. Right? It's probably driving some local optimization that might be hurting you. And metrics for guiding improvements, these type of metrics, they should only be temporary and discarded after you don't need it when the change is complete. So the benefits of having adaptive capability: no large-scale change initiatives, right? Costs you less money, less political risk. Your environment becomes sensitive to, you develop a skill to be sensitive to your changing external environment. Capability to change quickly and continually, and improved customer satisfaction. These are things that senior executives care about from a strategic perspective, right? So it's not just a case of sending them an emotionally compelling message. We can back it up with a story that explains how it's done. Service-oriented agenda. The thing that the middle managers might care about. So some of this is just basic revision. Kanban systems are pull systems. There's the Kanban limits at the top of the columns, and the work items get pulled through here as long as we're not breaking the limit. None of this should be terribly remarkable for people. This is something that a lot of people struggle to understand, but it's fundamental to the use of a Kanban system. Commitment is deferred. Until you pull something in here, it's not committed. Stuff upstream of this point is uncommitted. You're deferring commitment. So Kanban systems encourage the adoption of real option theory, where this is your options and these are committed work that are being turned into something real. Now, of course, unlike options in investment banks where you convert them in the blink of an eye, the conversion process here takes a bit of time, it costs money. Well, commitment is deferred, right? So we're committing to getting started at that point. We want to avoid discarding after commitment. We should only commit on something if we're really sure we want it. And if we had to discard it, we weren't sure, so we should learn a lesson from that. This is just a definition of the lead time in the Kanban system, right? So once we commit on something until we hit the first infinite queue, which is the end of the Kanban system, we can measure this system lead time. And this is important for something called Little's Law, which we use for doing forecasting and prediction, that the delivery rate equals the work in progress in the system divided by the system lead time. This is the algebra and this is the geometry. It's a cumulative flow diagram for things that are in our backlog. This is when we start them. This is when they're finished. And therefore, the height on any given day is the quantity of work in progress, the number of tickets on the board. Less obvious, maybe, and not so intuitive is this is the approximate average lead time for tickets started on this day. And therefore, the slope between them is the average delivery rate. So what makes this equation work is the fact that this is a fixed variable. And therefore, having a WIP limit, having the Kanban system in place makes the system a whole lot more predictable. So we want people to start with what they do now, but we want them to improve. And if it's the Kanban method involved, we want them to use Kanban systems. Well, often they'll say things like, Kanban's not applicable for us because it's really useful for a shared service environment. And we are a matrix-managed portfolio management big project environment. We don't have shared services. Oh, yes, you do. And now I'm going to show you how to see those. All right, so we've adopted this term, the Kanban lens. And the idea is that we want people to put on these sort of spectacles so that they can walk around their organization and they can see services where they previously didn't see them. Right, so what to look for. Creative work is service-oriented. Service delivery involves a workflow. Workflow involves a series of knowledge discovery activities. And what to do about that is map that knowledge discovery workflow. That's how you can design the Kanban board. Identify the service requests for new work. Who are the customers? What are they asking for? Track the work flowing through the service. All right, so you go around asking people, who are your customers or other stakeholders that you have to serve? What do they ask you for? What do you do to the requests? And where does the finished work go? We can see services if we look closely, and this will be hard for you to see. What we have here is a Kanban board for a big project. This was an ERP deployment quite a few years ago now, and it's a two-tiered board. These are features or epics, and this is user stories. And the green tickets sort of flow across. This is one big in progress, and this is testing. And then the yellow tickets, the user stories, flow across this way. And we've got multiple development teams with a lane each on this board. Well, if we look at this column, which uses Microsoft language for testing, resolved, we have a WIP limit here, and it says 5. The fact that that WIP limit is at the top of that column tells us that testing is a shared service in this project. If it wasn't a shared service, there would either be a WIP limit in every box or there would be no WIP limit. But a WIP limit at the top of the column, it must be a shared service. And so the point is that the testers are not embedded into these dev teams. The testers could be serving any team whenever there's a ticket. And you know that because the WIP limit's at the top of the column. I also know it because the testers were in an office in Chennai in India. Right. But you could have matrixed those people into these individual teams, but that wasn't the case. So we have a testing service. So we could go and Kanban that testing service in that Chennai office. Right? While it exists as a column on this big project board, they could have their own Kanban board, and they could treat these 5 dev teams as their 5 different customers. This area, I'm highlighting the orange tickets here. These are avatars for team members who are not attached to a specific team. So these avatars can be moved around. They're often referred to as floating team members. Many of these people are specialists, user experience designers, system architects, data architects, and so on. All those specialists are shared services. And therefore, the system architect or the data architect could have his own Kanban board, and he could be treating these groups or this project as a customer and other projects in the portfolio as customers. The user experience people on here, who are matrix managed from the UX department into this project, they could treat each lane, each team here as individual customers, and the UX people could sit back in their own UX department. They could have a little Kanban board beside their cubicle, and they could be having their own Kanban system in order to process this work. Why is this important? Because it makes their service delivery more predictable. And if service delivery on UX, on individual tickets, is more predictable, then service delivery on completed user stories is more predictable, which makes the entire project management more predictable. Right? One service cascading into another one and another one, you get predictability from the beginning, or the lowest level service, each one gets more predictable as you go up. And that's what I'm pointing out here. These dev teams building these features are essentially providing a feature development service to the project manager or the program manager. So what these guys do is they build one feature at a time to order. That's a service. So we found 3 services just looking at this board, and this would have been a big portfolio program, 55 people on this team, and it wasn't thought of as a shared service environment or in a service-oriented way. But if you can put on a pair of glasses that let you see it that way, it opens up the possibilities for improvements that you wouldn't see otherwise. This is another 2-tiered board. And what's going on here, these are epics, and these are user stories, and they're flowing across. So it's a very similar board to the previous one. And we've got columns at the end here for acceptance from the product owner, deployment, and this, although it says QA, it's a very specialist QA in this example. It's clinical validation testing for medical software. And each of these has WIP limits at the top and spanning the columns, which tell us that each of these is a shared service, even though one of them happens just to be an executive who's going to sign off on something. That's what the pop-up says. In this example, we're just highlighting different types of work. So we've got a department that services some customers, and they ask for different types of work. This is the equivalent to, someone walks into, Cafe Nero and they ask for a cup of coffee. The next person comes in, they ask for a cup of tea, and someone else comes in, they ask for scone. Different types of work coming in there. So we need to understand what the work types are, because different types of work usually have different risks. And we're visualizing that. This is visualizing different classes of service using colors. A class of service is just a set of policies for something, how something should be treated. And very specifically, it should have policy for the queuing discipline. How do tickets get pulled across here and in what sequence? Well, the most degenerate form of a queuing discipline is first in, first out. Whichever ticket went into the input queue first should get pulled across. A simple way of enforcing that is a policy that says, if you're idle and ready to pull something, pull the oldest available ticket. How do you make that work? You put the date stamp on the ticket when you start it. Right? But all that gives you is first in, first out queuing. that might not be appropriate for your risk environment. So you start adding different classes of service, different sets of policies, and you use different colors to highlight them. If people understand the risks associated with the colors, now you can have the situation where maybe an executive can walk past the board from 5-meter range, and out of their peripheral vision, they can get a feeling for what risks are being carried. Right? The guys who make the Lean Kit software refer to it as the 3-meter rule. That for anyone who's not on the project, the board should have sufficient power that from the distance of 3 meters, you know what you need to know from it. And, as long as they've had some education on what maybe colors mean and rows and so on. The same thing could be true of this. These rows could come from different stakeholders. Change requests might be from marketing, maintenance might be internal because we want to do re-architecting, and defects could come from customer care. Well, if you're the vice president of customer care, what you've learned is all the tickets for your department are on the bottom row of the board. If you walk past at 4 or 5 meters away and don't see a ticket in there, you might want to ask questions about it. Why are you guys not servicing any of our demand? Right, so the benefits of this service-oriented approach are improved predictability for the service, shorter lead times, which is almost always a fitness criteria, increased delivery rate, improved trust with business stakeholders, eliminated disruptions, and measurable benefits. There are circumstances where something like lead time isn't a fitness criteria. And there are circumstances where quality isn't. That list of big four, it's not always true. If you're a brand new startup developing a brand new product in a brand new market that's got a few enthusiastic buyers, do you care about quality? No. The whole definition of an enthusiast is they'll fix the bugs for you. Do you care about lead time? Yeah. Do you care about predictability? No, generally not. If you're brand new into a new market, who cares whether it comes out today or next week or the week after? You might care about how fast you're going, but not the precise promise, as long as stuff is coming out regularly. Once you've matured a bit and you've got a customer base and you start worrying about whether those customers are going to switch off your service onto someone else's, so you put out announcements about the new features that are coming in the March release. Do you care about predictability? Yes, you do. So you see how the fitness criteria change as the external environment changes. Right? As your market matures, the metrics you need to be using need to be moving with the times. And you need to be able to sense that in some way. Sustainability agenda, right? How do we provide relief from abuse? Well, first of all, I've talked a little bit about this, how big change initiatives feel is this big J-curve. We have some sort of current capability, current fitness for purpose. We decide to install a new methodology all over our organization and things get worse for a while. Ideally, eventually it should get better and we've arrived at our destination agile and the world is wonderful. The problem is that how much tolerance is there for how worse will it get and how long will it take before we get back to at least parity? And if there isn't the tolerance amongst the executive management, they will fire the change agents and they will abandon the change and regress back to where they started. So big change is very risky and it's hard to do. This is what we're trying to do with Kanban. Small, sustainable change. Now, Mike Burrows did this diagram for me, and you see that he's got a bit aggressive with the J-curves getting bigger. But this is a phenomenon that we've observed for real. That as people get good at doing lots of little changes, they develop the confidence to start doing bigger ones and to see them through. So, sustainable change starts with small change. You think about this with your personal lives also. It tends to be the way, right? That if you're trying to make some big change in your life, you usually have to start with some small increments, right? I'll meet people who will say, oh, I'd love to be a book author. And they'll say, how do you write books, David? And I say, well, start with a blog. Try doing a blog post, just one, right? That's your first step. And try and get in the habit, do a few more blog posts. And if you start getting good at blogs and you've got a bit of a following and people like it, maybe you can graduate to a magazine article or a guest blog on somebody else's site. And over time, it's like working out. How do you run a marathon, right? Well, if you can't run 100 yards, start with 100 yards. And you gradually build up. There's a bunch of guys in the Kanban community who run ultra marathons. These guys are weird. They run like 100 miles over 6 mountains. Well, how do you get to be an ultra marathon runner who can do that? Well, you start by running 100 yards and you build up from there. All right, there's another way of thinking about the problem. That throughout my entire career in the tech industry, demand has exceeded supply. Why is this? Because there is no shortage of human ingenuity and because the future is uncertain. And in order to deal with that, we need ideas, we need options, we need things to choose from. We never have enough capability, and this is great for all of us because we get paid really well in comparison to the rest of the human beings on the planet. There is no such thing as a poor IT worker anywhere you go in the world. Right? So demand exceeds supply, and it's going to stay that way until I retire, which is fabulous. Right? On the other hand, the fact that demand exceeds supply means that people who are generating the demand are unhappy to some extent. And therefore, fitness for purpose and customer satisfaction is associated with an ability to balance demand with capability. Naturally, when we think about this problem, we think, let's improve the capability. Let's take some more office space in a neighboring building and hire 300 more people. But there are other things we could do. We could shape the demand. Most other businesses do this. With simple things, even just like pricing, they can shape demand. And then we can look at causes of failure demand or disruptive and speculative demand. And we can try to eliminate those so that we reduce the weight of the demand, so that this gets lighter, so the scale will balance up, rather than trying to make this heavier. And actually, these things are probably cheaper and easier to do in many companies than this. Sometimes this isn't that hard until you reach some natural limit, like we filled our building up and now we need another one. And I meet companies like that. The Brazilian equivalent of Groupon is called Peixe Urbano, the fastest growing startup company in the Southern Hemisphere. And when I met them, they were about to abandon all the buildings they have and move into a brand new one, and that was after only 9 months. And scattered all over Rio de Janeiro were empty offices they were trying to sublet because that had kept happening to them. So the physical constraints can actually be, improving capability is not a linear problem, is really what I'm trying to communicate. Sometimes that can be good, right? Constraints can be good. They force you to think differently. So shaping demand, the way you do that in a Kanban system is capacity allocation policies. It's not the only way, but that's the main way. Kanban doesn't directly help you with this other than it visualizes it for you, because failure demand is a different type of work, like production defects in that example I had a little earlier. Disruptive speculative demand, things like estimating. And you can visualize those and you can gather data on the effect and the impact of having to do these things. And then you can make rational decisions about whether you should continue or not. So it gives you the emotional and the logical inputs to think about the problem and do something about it. It doesn't tell you what to do. And with improving capability, things like WIP limits, observing flow, measuring flow efficiency, focusing on sources of delay as a result of that, blockers and queuing and other things, Kanban gives you a lot of levers that you can pull to directly control capability without necessarily changing the way people work. So flow efficiency, I don't have this slide to pop up right now, but flow efficiency is the idea of if the lead time is this long, how much of that time did we spend working on something? And in many of the organizations where people collect and report this data at conferences, the answer is 5% or less. Håkan Fors from Stockholm measures this with his clients when he first gets there. He reports 1 to 2% is typical when he first engages a client. Well, let's pick 5% for a moment. Imagine that you have a development process and it's 5% flow efficient from the point where the customer commits on something to when you deliver it. And you've got some development and testing in that workflow. So 5% of the time is development and testing. Let's assume 2.5% for development, 2.5% for testing. The other rest of the time is 95% waiting, some form of delay. If you fire all your developers and replace them with new guys who are 10 times faster than the old guys, presumably because they're using Scala and not Java, how much faster does the lead time get? You improve development by tenfold, so you take the 2.5%, you shrink it to 0.25%. Right, so development is now 0.25 of 97.75. Testing's 2.5 still, and the rest is delay. The answer is that you get a 2% improvement. And so think about that. You made development 10 times faster. You made your service delivery 2% better. So what you should focus on isn't changing the way developers work or the way testers work. Although if they're generating failure demand because they create shit, that would be a different issue. But if it's delay you're worried about, or if it's that delivery rate you're worried about, eliminating delay gives you a lot more bang for your buck. So something I like to do now with private clients if I'm presenting stuff, and I've explained this, is then say to them, so the thing that's holding you back the most is delay. The biggest bang for the buck in improving this company is eliminating source of delay. So which one of you in the audience is in charge of it? Is there someone here who's the vice president of delay? It's at least that high of a position. Should be a senior vice president, perhaps. And of course, they're all laughing at this point, right? And I've got them emotionally engaged because they've suddenly realized the reason why their company's not improving is that nobody's in charge of the problem. Because it falls between the functional silos. And the work's largely been invisible, so it's not like a factory where you can walk around and see the inventory lying. If you do download the Blizzard ski case study, you'll read about that, the problem Blizzard had. They couldn't find inventory in their warehouse because it was so overcrowded. So this is Proto-Kanban. Proto-Kanban is where we're kind of pretending we're doing Kanban and we don't have a real Kanban system. We recognize a few different flavors of this that we see. There's personal Kanban in the office, and there's sort of aggregated personal Kanban where you see boards that have the names of people and they're on each row. And they're basically just a set of personal Kanban boards all in the one location. Then you get this, which is the infinite done queues. And this is particularly common, that basically, while we're limiting the work on activity columns here, so that we're limiting the multitasking for the workers, we're not limiting the size of these queues. There can still be an infinite amount of work in the whole system. So the system is not predictable unlike earlier when I showed you where there was a proper Kanban system. You can't predict the flow time through here with any degree of accuracy, but these workers feel relief from overburdening because of the WIP limit on how much they're individually doing. So proto-Kanban is still a benefit. It still provides an overburdening benefit, but it doesn't give you reliability. So it fits into the sustainability agenda, but it doesn't give you the service-oriented agenda benefit. You need the real Kanban system for that. This is another form of proto-Kanban. This is the per-person WIP limit, in this case enforced using avatar magnets. So each person on the team gets a magnet with a little picture of themselves or some sort of avatar. Around London here, South Park and other characters like that seem to be popular. And the tickets they're working on, they stick their avatar, and it limits the multitasking that they're being asked to do. It helps them with relief from abuse, but a system like this one still has an infinite WIP limit, and the flow time across this board is not predictable. So it's not that we don't like proto-Kanban. We actually love proto-Kanban. It gets people started. It's like, I want to write a book. Well, start with a blog post. This is your first blog post. And when you get good and confident at it, you can graduate to a full Kanban system and you can start to be more predictable. So the benefits of relief from overburdening and other disruption, greater transparency, engaging people emotionally, right? We've now put, if you just put a proto-Kanban in place, you've put in place a mechanism to engage system one and motivate people to implement further changes. You get collaborative working, greater empathy. Just visualizing stuff so people can see what's going on helps others understand the problems that some people were seeing and others weren't. And you get reduced multitasking, right? So this relief from overburdening. And these things make the environment better. Now, if we look at Kanban adoption around the world, my guess is 93% of it is this. Where do I get that number from? 93% of Lean Kit customers do not use WIP limits. Only 7% do. And that's not to include all the people with a physical Kanban board on the wall or a proto-Kanban. So the thing is that this is still good and people do it and they love it and they say, oh, we're already doing Kanban and we're already loving it. And they think they're finished and they've completely missed the other two great big opportunities they've got to improve service delivery and to improve the survivability of their organization. So that's why we believe in deep Kanban implementations and actually taking the time to learn about it in a deep way, because there's so much more benefit than just doing this, and benefit that can really be meaningful to the performance of the business. Right, so this is just a little reminder from the beginning here, right? Kanban compelling at every level. The senior level, we have the survivability agenda. That's how we sell it to senior people and how we demonstrate the evidence. The mid-level people, it's a service-oriented agenda. And the line level people and the individual contributors, it's a sustainability agenda. And thank you.